Hello, I'm Paul Briley, and you're listening to Off the Comma. On this podcast, we explore all facets of what it means to feel stuck in life. We talk with people just like us who have found themselves sitting on a comma and not knowing where to go next. We'll unpack the experience, where they felt stuck, what they experienced, and what they learned. My goal is to inspire you by seeing yourself in others and finding possibility for yourself. Let's get into this week's conversation. Welcome back, everybody, for another exciting episode of Off the Comma. Very cool to be here for another powerful story added to our kind of community of storytellers. I'm very excited for this week because once again, I get to meet somebody new that I haven't met before, kind of add another person's influence into my sphere. So I'm excited about that. Zac, who I'll let him introduce himself in just a moment, and I haven't met before, so I don't really have a whole lot, don't know a whole lot about the story that he's going to be sharing with us today. And that's what makes this so exciting, is that I get to learn more about people through their stories. And I'll be learning about Zac today. Also, Zac fulfills another kind of goal of the podcast that I've had since the beginning, almost a little over 3 years ago at this point. And that Zac is coming to us from Canada. So again, I'm a big proponent of let's hear voices from people all around the world, not just those of us here in the United States. And so Zac brings another international element to the podcast today. I know those of us here in North America could debate what that means and all of that good stuff, but you you are definitely international by definition. So, Zac, I'm going to stop rambling at this point. It's all about you and your story today. Zac, introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Why don't you start with how would you like to be known? Like, how would you describe yourself as a person?
Well, first off, Paul, thanks for having me today. Happy to be here and conversing with you and your audience. Um, you know, it's not so much as how I'd like to be known or the legacy I'd like to leave or even how I'd be identified or often misidentified for that matter. But for me, it's more about the quality of life, the vocation, and sort of what we're doing here. So
Hmm.
for me, I think it's all about value. I'd like to be known, if I were to be known, I suppose, as somebody who gave back, somebody who offered value to humanity, to the people that he interacted with, to the world, to the communities. And that's kind of in its simplicity. Really just I think value is important, you know.
Okay.
What are you giving back and how are you interacting in this life, this wonderful thing that we call life with other
Hmm.
humans?
I hear other words that I kind of hear in there, and I'll reflect throughout our conversation, Zac. So anytime I misreflect something or if I'm a little off the mark, just correct me. But I hear contribution in there, I hear service in there, and I believe, sort of this sense of responsibility to the greater, right? All of us, that sort of thing. Are those elements that kind
Yeah.
of come through in what you're
Yeah,
saying?
absolutely. Yeah, 100%, 100%. You know, I think we live in very interesting times.
Mm,
We could say that, I'm sure, of any time that anyone's been alive. You know, I'm sure they've always said that. But I think that now more than ever, community contribution and value are important. You know, it's there's a lot of people that are suffering these days. There's a lot of
mm,
turbulence. There's a lot of stories and narratives, really, is what it boils down to.
mhm.
And a lot of people get stuck in those, you know, and it's no slight to anyone. So I think if we can add value in whatever way that is, and for me, that's helping people realize the stories that they're living in are subjective and not
Mm.
objective truths. And, you know, once we're aware of that, then we can make the appropriate changes and we can kind of let go of that stuff that doesn't serve us.
I love it. You kind of will continue with your introduction, obviously, but like you
Sure.
got me thinking about, I see online and social circles, I see the comment a lot now, like it's all made up, nothing's real. And, I think it's often, what's the context in which that comment is being shared. But, I think about what you just described, and it's like, it really is true. Like, it's not easy, it's not simple necessarily, but it really is true. Like, our reality is shaped by what we think, feel, and believe. And in a sense, it really is all made up based on what you make it out to be in the moment, right? That's a gross simplification, but I'll shut up.
No, no, I
Here's your
mean
thoughts
not
on
at all,
that.
Paul. It's really accurate in my opinion, right? It's so it's real. I mean, there's objective reality, right? So
Hmm.
life is definitely real. It's just the way that we interpret it is the part that's
Hmm.
sort of irrational most of the time. The hypervigilant, maladaptive emotional structures that we live by, the lack of cognitive dissonance and the ability to see things for what they are outside of the interpretation of our stories and beliefs, as you said, is what
Hmm.
causes the disconnection, is what causes the turbulence. And what causes it is the fear, because we walk around in these maladaptive emotional structures, afraid that the illusion of the past is going to be projected into the fantasy of the future. And
Hmm.
we get stuck never actually living in the moment, just constantly living in our heads. And, in my opinion, that's not a way to live at all.
Yeah. Well, let's get into your story here before we jump into
Sure.
those questions. Just real quick by way of the rest of your introduction, anything else you want people to know about you, work, hobbies, interests, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That usual
I
piece.
mean, my interest is life, right? I mean, life is just such a phenomenon. It's an insurmountable experience, right? So, I mean, I love all of aspects of it. As we were just talking about before, the cooler weather that I'm not a huge proponent of where I currently reside, to the warmer weather that I'm really partial to
Hmm.
the interactions with humans and the magnificent food and the physicality of this life and the wonderful loves and vocations and interests that we can explore and all of the nuances and the new things that we have. It's an incredible experience to be
Nice.
able to live on this blue planet and follow our love and our passion.
Nice. Well, I'm excited to see, how some of these descriptions and some of the things that you've already shared with us show up in your story today. Before we jump into question one last question I have for every guest before we get started is, Zach, as you think ahead to the next, 30, 35 minutes or so sharing your story with us today, what intention would you have for yourself today?
Oh, good question. Really no intention for myself, just to share. I'm just happy to be here with you, as I said earlier. Grateful to be engaging and sharing a little bit of space with you today. And whatever unfolds in that space is wonderful, I think. And
Nice.
I fully accept that, and I'm grateful for it.
Okay, great. My intention today is to support you in your intention. Obviously, as you
Cool.
tell your story, there will be people out there who will see a little bit of themselves in you and your story that will make them feel a little bit more connected, a little less alone, and perhaps in the best of cases, maybe even feel inspired or empowered to go out and do something that they've been wanting to do.
Brilliant.
Let's dive in. So,
Cool.
question one, Zach, is where in your life have you found yourself sitting on a comma?
Mm. Well, the majority of my life has been a comma, Paul.
Okay.
What's next? What's next? Always looking to the future. Always living in the illusion. I suffered in the constraints of the egocentric mind and the illusion of the self for decades, really, before I came to the work that I do now. So for me, it was never content. It was never present. There was never any peace for me. So it
Hmm.
was always a comma. It was constant commas. What next? What next? What next? Never really realizing that there is no next. The only thing that there actually is right now.
Hmm. Let me jump in with kind of a clarifying question.
Sure.
This is also something that others talk about, but as we look specifically at you and your experience, I hear you in that kind of state, in that sense. What and I know this may not be a simple answer, right? So take us wherever you want to. What was driving that kind of always looking to the future, never knowing peace and contentment and presence? Like, what had you staying in the future so much?
Well, I mean, depends on how deep you want to go with this conversation, Paul, but it all starts in childhood, right? And it starts when the ego comes online, which is the pathology of the mind. It's formed in language, and it's a construct of the self, and it's separate from the experience of life. So the pathology of the ego is always trying to figure it out. It's always projecting, it's always righteous, it's always opinionated. And all of those things are essentially what we started this conversation with, the reality, the subjectivity of reality, not the objective reality. So the story that one has.
Hmm.
And for me, it was just a lot of suffering based on that, based on the splitting of the ego that usually happens in a child, roughly ages 3 to 5, once language comes online. It happens from an arbitrary experience always, and it has to do with the parents and the guardians. And that's where the child doesn't feel safe, doesn't feel loved, doesn't feel secure. And a child, a human that doesn't feel safe, secure, loved, will do anything that they can in order to be perfect, in order to meet those criteria and those requirements. And that's sort of where I, much like most humans, sought my journey down the road.
Mm. So, there's kind of the what all of us can experience and what can lead to all of us staying in the future. And so yours, you're saying, kind of really formed in childhood and fits these definitions that you talked about. What was that like
Yeah.
for you to kind of be always in the future and that kind of always thinking ahead?
Yeah. Well, it's a life of suffering, right? I
Hmm.
mean, it's never, it's missing out on the experience of life. It's not being present to anything. It's having an experience somewhere and being in your head about tomorrow.
Hmm.
It's having another experience somewhere and being lost in your head about yesterday. It's projection. It's unconsciousness. It's the inability to listen. You know,
Hmm.
well, most people listening is an art form, in my opinion. It's a skill set that the majority of people don't have. Most people are just waiting for you to stop talking so they can say what they want to say. And
Hmm.
it's no slight on them. That's just a construct of the ego, as I said
Hmm.
earlier, which is a pathology. It's not a natural occurrence. It's a formation and a construct of language. No language, no self. No self, no
Hmm.
ego. No ego, just life.
Hmm.
So,
When we explore these things here, as people come and share stories with us, I'm really curious, in what ways did this kind of show up and manifest in your life? Like, what kinds of stories did it create for you as a result of sort of experiencing this karma so frequently?
well, fear, um, uncertainty, anger, aggression, the 40 or so maladaptive emotions that we live by, that we do, that we address in my work, that we become aware of. And, once we're aware of them, we let go of them. And then they're no longer part of our experience anymore.
Hmm.
So that's really the majority of the experience is just negative bias, lack of joy, the
Mm.
inability to experience love, the ruminating mind. That's a big one for folks. When we're lost ruminating in our mind, thinking about the artifacts of the mind that we call the past
Hmm.
and projecting those into the future, then we miss out. We miss out on life. And not only that, but the majority of folks, anyone that I work with, anyone I've dealt with, anyways, is not projecting the most wonderful, joyous occasions of their life into the idea of the same thing happening in the future. It's
Mm.
always the scarcity and the fear and the things that we didn't like, the things that we don't want to happen again that we project.
Mm. Is there a particular, you said this was pretty common through most of your life. Is there
Yeah.
a particular example or time when, this really showed up and, kind of what happened as a result of it? As we kind of exploring question one is, what was it like to be sitting on the comma? Where and when have you sat on a comma? And then, we'll go into with the other questions a little bit more into what kinds of things you took from it or where you went next. But I'm curious, just, you know, so that we don't make assumptions, like, what were some specific or a specific time in your life where all of this really kind of revealed itself or showed itself?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, it didn't really reveal or show itself so much because, there's the old expression, you can't see the forest through the trees, right?
Mm,
So, I mean, when you're in the thick of it and you're living it, it doesn't actually reveal itself. It's not until we get some clarity, until we have some freedom, sort of mentally speaking, that we can actually see where we're sitting on these commas all of our
mm,
life, which, I mean, we live our lives. If the experience that we have of life is, what we put out, I like to say that love is like a boomerang. So what you throw out is what comes back to you. So if you live in a life that's horrible and negative and fear-based, then that's the experience that you have. You have experiences like that. You have traffic jams where people yell at you. You have jobs where you have narcissistic bosses who demean you. You have spousal children relationships that are lacking love or aggressive. You have a life of that. It's only when
mhm,
you actually let go of that stuff and you change your frequency, per se, that you have different experiences. And so for
mm,
me, the commas were really any situation. There was never contentment, there was never peace in my experience. It was always the next thing. It was always a sense of unease and a sense of uncertainty and fear. And every avenue from sporting events to family dinners to job interviews and really every aspect of my life for a very,
Hmm.
very long time.
I see. Okay.
Yeah,
I think a lot of people can really relate to that, as I'm
sure.
sure you're already aware. It's like the I think about this too, self-referencing in the context of, our hustle culture, particularly here in the United States. I don't think it's a whole lot different there in Canada, us westernized folks. The hustle culture, the grind, the productivity mindset, the sense of urgency at all times. What I'm hearing you describe is like it's not even so much about the this example or that example or this story or that story. They all had this in common, and the story itself was the living in the future, kind of the constant drive, I'm using some of my own words here, but the push,
Sure.
the hustle, the grind, the sense of urgency and so forth, that really
Yeah.
was what was driving the bus for so many years.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those are essentially all of those things for the most part are just coping mechanisms. They're just,
Mm.
as I said earlier, with the splitting of the child and the ego coming online at age 3 to 5 and the not feeling loved. I mean, the simplistic explanation of that would be with animals. Like I use the analogy of the bear a lot of the time, right? So the mother bear takes care of the baby bear. That's the job of the animal. She hides the baby away as it neurologically develops. And then once the baby bear grows up, it wanders off and it lives its own life, right? And if anything tries to happen to it, if the papa bear tries to do something to the baby bear, the mother bear will maul it to
Hmm.
death, and the mother bear doesn't traumatize the child. But what happens is when the narcissistic parents are fighting in the kitchen, when something happens with the child and it sees this and it feels unsafe, when the mother yells at the child, which the bear mother does not do to the cub,
Mm.
then it has a split because the mother is the safety mechanism. The mother is what's supposed to coddle and foster the child. And when that doesn't happen, the child has a sense of confusion because it can't run to the mother because the mother is the source of the fear. So that's when it splits and that's when the ego comes online. Now,
Mm.
children are human beings and human beings are sentient. So we can think, right? We have these incredible minds. So what the child does is when it feels these emotions, these butterflies, when it feels the heart rate, the elevated blood pressure, it uses its sentience and it thinks this is about me. And so the child now does anything it can to be safe, to be loved.
Mm.
The baby bear doesn't have to do that. The mother just does that automatically because there's no ego with animals. They don't have the
Mm.
ability for that. So that's really where the problem starts in childhood. And then the rest of the human's life is spent trying to be safe, trying to be perfect, trying to be okay in all aspects. And as you said, the grind and the hustle, right? So, what does a grind and a hustle mean? Well, I'm grinding so that I become successful. Why? Because I'm not successful now, is what you're actually saying. And
Mm.
when you're successful, then you'll be enough. Then you'll be loved. Then you'll be okay. When I get that special partner, when I get that job, when I hustle, hustle, hustle. As I grind too, I'm also distracting myself from the moment because the hustle and the grind is a projection into the illusion of the future, a
Mm.
someday fantasy of when I graduate, when I get that new job, when I get that house, when I get that wife, when I have those kids, when I
Mm.
retire. And we spend the majority of our lives in this illusory construct of next, 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 just trying to be okay, never
Mm.
actually living in the moment where we are. Kind of
Mm.
a long-winded answer to your question, but
Yeah, but I think, I mean, it's enlightening because, you gave us a number of examples, generalized examples that I think any of us could potentially, apply to and relate to in our own experience, right? So,
yeah,
I mean, you mentioned a lot about, when this type of split happens in childhood and so forth. I mean, I have my own experiences with, my mother and my family of origin and how I was raised and so forth. I think a lot of people can really kind of, insert my story here, so to speak. Yeah.
absolutely.
This next question, question two, is an invitation to kind of expand. You can go backwards, you can go forward, however, whichever direction you want to go. But the question is, as you look back at, for you in your case, these commas that you sat on through a major part of your life, what did it create for you? I feel like you've already answered that question a little bit, but what else would you add? What else would you expand on here?
Sure. Well, I mean, so for me, I kind of always had a sense that there was something more.
Hmm.
And that more, like I said, a lot of that was those maladaptive emotions that I was living by, that fight or flight reaction that I was stuck in, as the majority of humans are, who don't bring the awareness to their lives and who don't actually do this work that I'm sort of speaking to. Um, and so for me, it was always that sense. It was always the sense of there's got to be something more to this. Um, to my demise, a lot of that was because I searched for more knowledge. I tried to acquire more things. I tried to become better, become good enough. Now, this wasn't a conscious thing, right? People don't know that they're doing that consciously.
Hmm.
But their story dictates that, and that's the way that they follow. So for me, it was always more. Ironically, as I moved through the different circumstances and situations in my life, as I experienced setbacks and as I moved forward, per se, I realized that no matter what I got, no matter what I achieved, it was still empty. It was still meaningless in itself. There
Hmm.
was always the next, you get a quick dopamine hit and you're feeling good for 5 minutes and then bang, it's on to the next thing, right? So initially that wasn't so great for me, but once I finally came to the precipice of realizing that life is now, not tomorrow, because tomorrow doesn't exist, for me, that was where the commas stopped. And that was where I sort of really came into the present moment, developed the methodology that I use with others because I used it on myself first,
Hmm.
and then sort of let go of everything that didn't serve me.
Hmm. I so appreciate what you're sharing there in some of those examples, and particularly, I think so many of us can relate to this like pursuit, hunt for more, whether it's things or experiences or knowledge or information. Like there's this hole that can't seem to be filled, right? And I can certainly relate to that in my life, Um, some schools of thought would call things, addictive personalities or what have you, right? But there's the thing that needs to be fed, and somehow it can't ever find the right diet to feed itself, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, humans are just trying to feel better, Paul. And that's all addiction
Hmm.
is, right? Addiction is the body working, the physiology working exactly how it should be doing. The brain upregulating and downregulating receptors based on exogenous chemicals that are put in, whether that be drugs, alcohol, physicalities, and whether that be things like gambling, sex, whatever it may be, that also alters the physiology of the brain too. And the brain works perfectly every single
Hmm.
time as it upregulates and downregulates. That's why we have addiction for sure, and that's why people reach for things in an attempt to quell the suffering, to quell the
Hmm.
inadequacies, to quell the lack of peace and contentment in their
Mm.
lives.
It's so interesting too, right? Because, here in Western culture, you know, my opinion is that our culture is consumption, right? And it's the consumption because obviously that's where our economy is built. But I think it's also we've become ideal consumers because there's so much of again, I am pontificating here. This is my point of view and opinion, but there's so much of a lack of, sense of connection and identity and purpose and so forth. So consumption is a perfect thing, right? And hence our economy,
Absolutely.
right? I can go buy whatever I want and satisfy my needs, in the mainstream market or the black market or whatever, right? So,
Yeah, 100%.
what was your thing then as you talk about always kind of pursuing knowledge things and so forth? Like, if there was, I'm making an assumption here, but like, what was it? When you say you were always pursuing knowledge, what kinds of knowledge when you were pursuing things, what kinds of things, like what were you clawing at in order to kind of scrape it into the hole?
Yeah, so I mean, I've pursued many avenues in my life. We need a few days to talk about all the things that I've done, from studying biology or organic chemistry to running a construction company for many years to doing automation to, you know, Many, many, many avenues, many different modalities. For me, the knowledge specifically, a lot of the time was just to try and quell my suffering and my inadequacies. I dealt with a lot of physical issues for many years,
Mhm.
which was a direct relation to the extent in which I experienced fight or flight, which is, as we
Mm,
talked earlier about the children, when that gets triggered on and we get sent into this mechanism where we're not operating in life, but inside the story of a reactionary basis inside the mind. When we're in fight or flight, we feed the amygdala, which is the little nut-shaped portion of the brain designed for either fighting for our life or running for our life. And the more that we feed that, the less we feed the neocortex, which is the expansive, creative version of our brain, which is the all encompassing, healthy, homeostatic, biologically optimized human organism. So,
mhm.
essentially, what that means is the more that we feed fear, the more our organism degrades, and then we wind up with diseases, cancers, diabetes, obesity. We wind up with, as we talked about earlier, addictions. And the more we bring exogenous chemicals and substances into our body, the more we degrade our organism further as we're living in this fight or flight mechanism of fear. And so, for me, for many years, the knowledge was trying to alleviate the physical suffering I felt, the physical
Mm,
pain, I should say, I felt, as well as the mental suffering.
mm,
Um, and it served me very well as I aged more, as I got closer to leaving this beautiful planet, because it helped me to understand a lot of the modalities around the human organism as I discovered the mind and the mental constructs that we have, and so the two of them managed to mesh together really well, and it gave me the
mm.
ability to help myself and therefore to help others as well.
I love that because, I think there's so many different things that people will pursue, even just in this vein of knowledge that we're talking about in your story and your experience. And, what I believe I'm hearing you say, correct me if I'm wrong, is like I literally was seeking the answers to the things that I, viewed as my problems or experienced as my problems at the time. Some people, it might be, that they just love learning more about self-development or self-help or what have you. But I think even as I reflect on that and my own kind of pursuits and things to learn, I would say a lot of those are also potentially, the answers to the problems that I believe that I have.
Exactly.
Um, and, and then there's other things that I'm just consuming like crazy, yet I see them as being much more healthy, travel and experiences and getting outdoors and so forth. But yet there's still an underlying vein of let me consume as much as I can of it. Let me see if I can, like, somebody hold my beer and let me see how far I can go and how many places I can go and so forth. And then there's like, a scale there of distinctions between that versus, when I used to drink wine, for example, or what have you. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it all depends on what you want out of this life, right?
Hmm.
And at the end of the day, human beings just want a sense of peace, power, contentment, and connection.
Mm.
And as we were kind of talking about with the emotional structures that we live by, the frameworks that we live by, the fight or flight mechanisms that we live by, well, whether it be mild or severe, there's a very big distinction and a difference between following one's love and passion and exonifying your vocation than there is gaining more knowledge, consuming more, 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 more.
Hmm. Mm. Before I go to question three, which begins some of our kind of reflection, I guess it's all reflection, right? But I'm curious, you've been very clear throughout your narrative so far that something did change, though. So, what did change? What was the shift? When did it happen? I mean, it sounds like it happened gradually because of your pursuit of knowledge and constantly learning, but what would you say or attribute the shift to? Like, when did it change?
I think, like you said, Paul, it was kind of an ongoing thing. It was realizing, having those aha moments per se, and just realizing like, oh, this is just not accurate at all. Having reflections. For me, it was starting to ask questions. Anybody that doesn't work with me, people all ask me all the time. Like, what can I do? How can I just feel better? I've got this anxiety, I've got this depression. How can I just feel better? And I always tell people it's awareness, right?
Hmm.
So you don't know what you don't know. There's no slight with that. But once you know, now you know. So you have a choice as to what you're going to do with it, right? And everybody knows initially. It's just a lot of the time we pile a whole bunch of crap on top of it over decades so that it gets pushed down and muddied and we can't really see it clearly anymore. So it's
Hmm.
all about awareness, right? So for me, what I did over the succession of the events of my life was I started to ask more questions instead of just projecting righteous opinions. I started to question things, I started to listen more to what people were saying. And I suppose, and as I got triggered in my egocentric narcissism, I would pay more attention to that and realize, like, oh, that person just said something. Is that accurate or is that not? And the more I questioned things, the more I became aware. And it all just kind of came to me, the more I let go of things that didn't serve me and the more I became aware of them, the more inertia got behind that. So it's like the theory of the snowball rolling down the hill. It starts
Hmm.
off as a tiny little thing, and before you know it, it picks up steam and it's this massive ball just hurling down the side of the mountain. So it kind of happens that way. You just sort of, once you're aware, and then you start to see things everywhere.
Hmm.
Once you know the road broadly, you see it in every aspect. And then once you see things, you can't unsee them. And once you know things, you can't unknow them. So for
Yeah.
me, that's how I approach life. It's
Well,
a knowing as opposed to a belief. So
yeah. Well, and then I would even add to this, from my own experience, I don't know if this is true for you, but it's like the more you know, the more I know. Let me state myself very clearly. The more I know, the more I realize that I know less than I think. And then the more okay I get with not always having to know things, right?
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
knowledge is absolutely useless in terms of the qualitative experience of our life, Paul. The
Hmm.
analogy I use with a lot of my clients and people at the time is the apple pie, right? A slice of apple pie. I could teach you everything about apple pies. We could come into Zach's culinary kitchen and we could check the perfect temperatures of ovens and what we're going to use. And we could know where to get the best apples and how to slice them and what the perfect sugar versus water content is. And none of that, we could study that for years, and none of that is actually going to give you the experience of eating a
Hmm.
slice of apple pie,
Hmm.
right? And we could
Hmm.
eat a slice of apple pie and we could know absolutely nothing about any of the things that I just said at Zach's Culinary Kitchen. And there's a very big distinction between the knowledge and the experience. And you see, we're human beings. We're not human
Hmm.
thinkings, right? They called us human beings because we're in a physicality. We're in this beautiful plane that we call Earth. And we're meant to experience that. We're not meant to be thinking about experiencing it. So, I mean,
Hmm.
acquiring more knowledge does absolutely nothing for us. It's completely useless, except for the small circumstances and instances where we actually are free and peaceful. We have a love
Hmm.
and a passion, and now we pursue that in order to understand it more fully. That's a big distinction that's different.
Yeah, I love it. And even if we just boil it down to just a really basic ex but important example, like the knowledge of what goes into a food recipe, for example, staying with your food and cooking and kitchen metaphor, right? A
Yeah,
simple recipe and capturing that knowledge, the apple pie recipe and capturing it to be able to have it, in the old days, having it on the 3x5 card in the box, or today having it in the recipe file or in the recipe app or what have you. The whole point is that you do something with it, right? It being an aggregation of knowledge that has been captured is in and of itself pointless. The whole point of that recipe is that then people will find it and cook with it and enjoy the cooking and the pie in and of itself, right?
exactly.
You said something earlier I wanted to circle back on. It's a little bit of a stretch now at this point, but you were talking about how powerful it was for you to start asking more questions. And, that's very powerful for me too. I've always kind of used it in my line of work, but when I went through my coach training, I started seeing not only how powerful it was in a work setting, but just in life in general. And I kind of landed on two things. Tell me what you think. Like, obviously, asking questions is powerful because you may learn something, and yet there's all these other kind of benefits to asking questions as a habit and as a practice, right? One, it puts the attention back on other people, which generally, I would say, mostly adds value because other people feel seen and heard and so forth. Can be, depending on the context. But I think the other thing that I learned about myself in the asking questions is that because of my insecurities, my need to prove myself to myself and others and so forth. I'm still guilty of this. love to be the person with the answers, the person who knows, the who, what, when, where, why, how, and so forth. And so I had a bad habit of if somebody asked questions, I always had an answer for it. Didn't ever even stop to think whether I was right, whether I needed to be the person answering, all the things, right? I was the one who had the info, the intel. Um, Back to the point of asking questions. Asking questions can bring value because we can learn new things. Asking questions can bring value because it allows us to engage other people and put the attention on other people, center them. And for me, it was a habit break. Asking questions prevented me from giving answers when I didn't necessarily need to be the one giving answers. So I don't know. It's just me throwing a little build onto what you shared, but what would you say about
Yeah,
that to your experience or
yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing about the ego is opinionated, right? The ego is righteous. The ego always has it figured out. The ego loves to point fingers, but it doesn't love to point thumbs very much.
mm,
So, in the idea of always knowing the answer, it's very difficult for the ego to not know. The ego doesn't know. Well, what's it going to do when it doesn't know? And more importantly, it doesn't even look that far because it's so concerned and so uh, wrapped up in the idea that it does know in its
hmm
own righteous mentality. So, absolutely. I mean, for me, that was I used to be I used to have the structure of a grandiose narcissist, a
mm,
covert and probably a people pleaser to some degree as well. And those are all just coping mechanisms, most of them. Most of them
hmm
are ways in order for us to interact with other people, in order for us to be okay, and in order for us to keep the stories that we have about the way that we should be and that we are okay. So
mm,
it's really no different for most people. There's nuances in the story and the framework, but all human beings are the same because we all experienced a similar version of what happened. I mean, the stories, the arbitrary experiences that split the child when it's 3 to 5 years old are always very similar. They're always the same. It's
hmm
one child broke a giraffe, the other child heard the parents arguing in the other room. Child got its hand slapped because it didn't wash it before it ate dinner. They're all very, very, very similar. And so are the mechanisms that the ego tries to personify and pursue in order to be okay throughout its life. So,
hmm
yeah,
It,
absolutely.
it it's interesting because I think about that, those examples that you just gave, and I'm not trying to simplify this entire study of attachment and the different kinds of attachment and so forth, but it's interesting.
Mm,
Like I think a little takeaway for me is like there are some who would say, well, that's parenting, right? You've got to correct people, you've got to correct children, you've got to, let them know when they're doing something wrong. And I think what I saw in the examples that you shared, like there's a distinction between correcting and educating versus attacking.
yeah.
And in those examples, like each of those very much is perceived by the child as an attack, not a correction. They can
Well, that's
see
the
the
thing,
difference
Paul.
in the
Yeah.
intention, right?
Yeah, I mean, it gets kind of tricky there, right? Because it's not the intention of any parent, even the ones that are, essentially like sociopathic or psychopathic, to actually inflict harm.
Mm,
The ego always thinks it's doing the best that it can in every circumstance, even though other egos looking at that circumstance and situation don't agree.
hmm
So, I mean, the thing is like the job of a parent, as we sort of talked about earlier with the mother bear that fosters and hides the baby bear away as it develops, as its neurology comes online, is the same thing with a human baby. The purpose of a parent is not to raise a child that they can live vicariously through. The purpose
hmm
of a parent having a child is to foster that child, use the resources that they have, and present that child with as many things as they possibly can. And what that child gravitates towards, fostering and nurturing that to the best of their ability, keeping the child safe,
hmm
not causing it to split by arguing with the husband in the kitchen as the child can hear, not arguing to begin with, right? Because the problem with the argument to begin with, that's ego in itself. That's
hmm
righteousness.
hmm
People who are peaceful and content don't need to argue their point to their spouse because those type of people wouldn't need to spend their lives with a spouse like that.
hmm
It always goes back to that. That's righteousness. People are fighting each other in the kitchen as the child is listening in the other room because of their point. And it's their fear and scarcity. It has to
hmm
do with the money. It has to do with what the husband did or didn't do. It has to do with the work situation or the lack of funds to pay for things. whatever it may be, or what the child did at school, or why the child is not pursuing the sporting, the hockey game or something that the parents wanted them to do as they're trying to live vicariously through the child.
Mm,
So it gets kind of tricky, but it doesn't really, because the basic job of a parent is the same as the basic job of an animal. And
mm,
that's just to care for and foster the youth and the child.
mm. Let me ask question three. So as you look back at these commas that you were sitting on, as you've described, in so much like detail, what have you learned about yourself as a result of sitting on those commas?
Well, main thing I've learned about myself is that the self is an illusion,
Mm,
right? I mean, there is no self because the self is just a story. The self is an ego, right? I mean, they call me Zach. That's not actually who I am. It's useful, somebody says, "Hey, Zach," and it's, "Oh, hey, how's it going?" We have a
hmm
conversation and things are great, but it's not actually who I am. They call me a Canadian, but that's not who I am. That's just a place that I was born in this world, which is also made up, just like the
hmm
United States is made up. We make some noises
hmm
with our mouths and we we call these things and we describe these things. It's useful sometimes, but then we get things like patriotism, then we get things like projection and attachment to certain constructs. We have somebody who pursues a career as a teacher, as a doctor, as a lawyer, and they identify with that and they say, "I'm a doctor, teacher, or a lawyer." And then somebody who identifies with these set of beliefs and constructs will do things, whether they're ideal or not, that revolve around that framework.
hmm
And unfortunately, they're limited in that aspect too, whether it's social, political, religious, whatever it may be, because when you have a belief and you have a construct wrapped around that, now you can't have an experience outside of that,
hmm
which is really unfortunate in this life that is actually unlimited. So, the self is an illusion. I haven't actually learned anything about myself because
mm
I don't look at it. I let go of the idea that I have a self and I just live in the moment, adding
mm
value as we started this conversation as my intention, operating with the integrity that the being that they call Zach has developed is, and, living that.
Okay. Let me move on to the fourth question. And you've shared some, I think you've shared some answers to this question, but what has changed for you as a result of sitting on those commas?
Well, I mean, life is constantly changing, right? So, the more that I live in the moment, the more that I live presently. I'm a human being, so I'm flawed as well. I'm just like everybody else. I'm perfectly imperfect, but I no longer strive for that ideal of perfection. And I no longer sit on those commas because I've fostered and I've developed an awareness.
Hmm.
So I can see now when the mind starts to get active. I can see when things come up that I'm perplexed by, and I lick my lips at it, metaphorically speaking, because life will present you with circumstances and situations to reveal where you're not free. And what a blessing that is, because you get to grow, you get to evolve, and there's nothing like peace and contentment in this world. It's
Hmm.
a blissful momentary experience that doesn't require us sitting on any commas of any sort.
Hmm. Okay. Well, then this last question might seem a little bit redundant, but it's part of the format, and I always ask it. So, as
It's all
briefly or
good.
as much detail as you care to share, what does getting off the comma look like for you?
Yeah, it looks like awareness. It looks like acceptance, and it looks like surrender.
Mm,
And that's not to be, reclusive or reluctant to life. That's to see things as they are, accept them, be okay with that, and then be committed to the love, the value, the passion that you have. We're each unique incarnations in this world. We each have a special gift and a uniqueness to us that
mm,
we need to share if we want to experience a life of contentment and bliss. Because there's gifts that I have that you don't have. There's gifts that you have that I don't have, that everybody has. And that's kind of full circle to the child that splits when they're 3 to 5 years old. What happens then, majority of the time, is the parents don't foster those gifts.
Mm,
They usually tell the child that you won't be successful doing that. You can't make enough money to do that. That's not acceptable. This isn't what the family does. A whole milieu of nonsensical stories that wind
hmm.
up squashing the child's intuition, squashing the child's love. And for that reason, they don't pursue that. They go into what mom and dad say they have to go in, whether they have a choice or not in the matter. And then they end up resenting that when they're older. And they wind up sort of just flittering away their actual gift that they have and pursuing something that 9 out of 10 times doesn't resonate with them or the rest of humanity.
Hmm. It, I, I like there's a couple of things that I could say here, but an acknowledgement that I think
Yeah,
the most important thing I want to say here is like I really appreciate, your narrative and your kind of framing of that based on your experience. And yet it's interesting because so many people land on this fifth question with things that are very similar to that: awareness, acceptance, surrender, and come to that through so many different kinds of experiences and circumstances and learnings and so forth. So it's really cool to hear you share, landing in that place and then kind of looking back over your story and seeing how you came to that place too. That's always fun and exciting for me as the host to see and kind of witness in the story. So,
awesome.
Zach, as we kind of wrap up the conversation today, the last two things for every episode is for folks who say, this wasn't enough, I want to learn more, I want to hear more, I want to see what you're up to. Tell us, where can people find you? I'll be sure and put the links in the show notes so people can go straight there and click on those links. Where can people reach out?
Easiest place to find me is just on my link tree, which is just my name, linktree/Zac Russell.
Awesome.
They can find all my stuff on there, podcasts, socials. They can find the information on the coaching. I actually just came out recently with an audio course as well, and that mimics the one-on-one coaching session. I
Mm,
call it coaching for lack of a better descriptor, but it's actually just a conversation. And it sort of mimics that one-on-one conversation without the live reflection and guidance that I provide, but it's useful for a lot of people.
okay,
So
great.
that's all available there as well.
Awesome. Last thing before we close out is a section that I call acknowledgments, because you being here today, sharing your story with us, really is kind of what this podcast is all about. Our intention is that we, take inspiration from everyday people like ourselves. We don't have to be told what to do, and that, everybody's story can yield value to someone, if not many people. So your story wouldn't be complete if we didn't give you an opportunity to also lift up others. And so with this section, it's your opportunity to boost or give a voice to or just lift up others who matter to you. That can be causes, organizations, it could be other creators, or just important people in your life. So who would you like to acknowledge today? And I'll be sure to reference them in the show notes as well.
Oh, geez, that's a great question, Paul. I think everybody that's come into my life, I'd like to acknowledge, whether that be clients, friends, family, acquaintances. I think everybody, like we were just talking before, has their uniqueness and their gifts. And even though they may not feel that way, their interaction with other people is essential to this life. I mean, everybody is an intrinsic part of this life. There is no distinction between my life and your life because there is no such thing as my life and your life. The
Hmm.
same way there's actually, in objective reality, no such thing as a Paul or a Zach. You are an intrinsic part of this life, and without you, life would not be all that it is. So I'd like
Hmm.
to acknowledge everybody out there doing the best they can with what they have. And, that's kind of it.
Okay, nice. Well, Zach, I thank you so much for joining us this week, for sharing your story with us today, joining our community of storytellers here at Off the Comma, and just so appreciate you sharing, your experiences with us today. So I will definitely be following your story ahead, and wish you the best of weekends ahead.
Thanks, Paul. I really appreciate you having me here.
What an honor it is for me to hear and share these powerful stories. I hope you feel the same way. Think about what you learned from this conversation. I encourage you to write it down in some form of journaling or reflection, because surprises can reveal themselves to you when you write your thoughts down. If you were moved by today's conversation, pass it along to someone you care about. And if you do discover something you'd like to unpack further, book a call with me and let's talk about it. My links are in the show notes. Be sure to like this episode and follow the podcast here on this platform and all social media at Off the Comma. Feel free to interact and comment. Thank you for listening to this episode of Off the Comma. As always, keep noticing and keep listening.